Right, can people please take their seats? We're going to begin very shortly. So as people are coming in, if they just like to take their seats and so on, this is going to be, as you know, a very interesting session. The theme, well, the broad theme is liberalism. So if people are coming in, if they'd like to take their seats, we can get underway. Good. So our speaker for this session is Adrian Vermeulen. Vermeulen, as some of you will recognize, at least I certainly did, is a Flemish name. And so we were discussing just briefly, he and I, some aspects of that. But there's more to be discussed about the culture of Flanders and the culture of Europe in general, which, interestingly, actually, Flemish culture was quite important at a certain point in the evolution of liberal ideas in Western Europe, but I don't think it's going to be those that will be under discussion this morning. So the title of Professor Vermeulen's address to us today is Liberalism and the Invisible Hand. Let me just tell you a few things about him. He's a well-known figure, but for the benefit of those who don't live in the world of political and legal thought, let me just say he's Ralph Tyler Jr., Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. He is himself a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Prior to taking up the current academic position that he has in the law school there, he was Bernard Meltzer Professor of Law in the University of Chicago. A very interesting and influential law school with some very interesting people there. Richard Posner, of course, famously there, Cass Sunstein, and so on. He's the author or co-author of 9 books, most recently Law's Abnegation, From Law's Empire to the Administrative State, The Constitution of Risk, The System of the Constitution. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And his principal areas of scholarly work are on administrative law, the administrative state, a theme that's been very prominent in conservative writings, I suppose, particularly in the last decade. The design of institutions and constitutional theory. I had the pleasure of reading recently a review by him of a book by another contributor to this conference, Patrick Deneen, in a journal established not so very long ago by somebody else who's here, Gladden Pippin, American Affairs. That review is of Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. Whether or not Professor Vermeulen is going to be speaking about the failures of liberalism this morning, I'm not altogether sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't get a mention. So please welcome our speaker, Professor Vermeulen.
Thank you so much, John. You're absolutely correct that my ancestors bear some share of the blame for the growth of liberalism. I'll try to make some recompense today as a believer in collective responsibility. And I want to thank Carter and Margaret for having me here. It's wonderful. It's my first time at this conference, and it's just terrific. So, without further ado, I want to argue today that liberalism as a constitutional order rests in principle upon a series of invisible hand systems, more or less free competition in explicit economic markets, free competition in the marketplace of ideas, institutional competition among branches of government, and so forth. Yet liberal faith in these systems far outruns any of the social scientific mechanisms or evidence that are adduced to support them. And this isn't happenstance. I want to say it's a consequence of systematic problems that arise when liberal theory dispenses with the invisible hand of providence in favor of secular mechanisms. So first of all, a dilemma of verification afflicts invisible hand systems in virtue of their indirect structure. That is, by their terms, it's not generally possible to directly verify whether they are performing as promised. Second, there are self-undermining mechanisms within liberalism that threaten to prevent its invisible hand systems from fully realizing their promise. The main mechanisms, or really these are large families of mechanisms, are the depletion of pre-liberal social capital and public choice problems, both of which cause the agents posited by liberalism to act in ways that subvert the invisible hand processes themselves. So given this structural propensity to imperfect secularization, imperfect realization of secularized invisible hand systems, liberalism stands in an unhappy, chronically unstable halfway posture, caught between its rejection of providence and a kind of self-destructive appreciation of its own contingency. Having dispensed with superintending design in favor of contingent mechanisms, liberalism is then astonished to find that there is no guiding hand on its own account to ensure the fulfillment of its own faith. And the predictable reaction is a kind of liberal fideism, a will to believe that insists ever more stridently on the truth of liberalism's unverifiable and potentially self-defeating claims. Okay, my main interest is in liberalism as an operating constitutional regime with various subsystems, not in liberalism as academic political theory, but the two are partially connected, and I need to say a few preliminary words. Liberalism as theory I take to be a kind of clan of doctrines, of which theological, political, and economic liberalism are the main branches. All these are animated more or less directly by the fateful thought that some have described as the, quote, fundamental liberal principle, unquote, that the autonomy of the individual's reason and desires is normatively basic, and any departure from it needs justification, especially vis-a-vis the arbitrary commands of a sovereign or of oppressive custom. Now, there's a widespread but cartoonish depiction of this, especially as to political liberalism, in which people say that liberalism eschews any theory of the good in favor of a theory or theories of the right, or sometimes people talk in terms of neutrality and so on. Professional political theories long since relaxed this constraint, moving into these sort of interminable debates over perfectionist and anti-perfectionist liberalism. In the strains of liberalism that I will focus on, it's just not even true that liberalism advertises itself as eschewing any concern for the good for human beings. So that's an unfair claim, not one I'll make. What is true is that this very large stream of liberal thought and systems that I'll discuss aims to produce human goods indirectly. That's its key feature. It aims to produce human goods indirectly, through and by means of the operation of freely chosen individual action. In this way, liberalism hopes to square its master commitment to autonomy with its correlative horror of direction by authority and of obedience. So on this picture, human goods will not be secured in virtue of authoritative commands, not in virtue of ordinances of reason for the common good promulgated by one in authority with care for the community, but instead will emerge at the systemic level out of the freely chosen decentralized acts of individuals themselves. Whether in economic, political, or legal systems, goods will arise, as Adam Ferguson said, as a result of human action, but not of human design. The theologian Henri Grenier put this succinctly in just an outstanding treatment of this, a short treatment, but compressed and brilliant. He said, the advocates of liberalism imagine that the liberty of man living in society tends to what is best. We don't have here a claim about, neutrality as to the good or something. It's that liberty itself tends to what is best. Hence, they hold that the end of civil society is the protection of private rights from which peace and harmony result. This is the opinion of Quesnay and Adam Smith. Grenier does not say that the end of liberalism is the protection of private rights full stop. The structure of the claim is that liberty produces goods at one remove, and the goal of the constitutional order is to protect rights so that various goods may result from them. And then when we move into Grenier's account of economic liberalism, we see this structure of decentralized individual interactions So under his account of economic liberalism, private utility is the aim of economic life because it is the individual who can best seek, know, and promote his own interests. And the first law of economics is free competition, the free play of economic individuality, seeking by any lawful means the greatest advantages. Each of these points is important. The first says that the liberal invisible hand, although anticipated to produce goods, is directed at private individual goods or an aggregate of such goods, rather than a genuinely common good. So this is a terribly important subject that I will not discuss further today, but this claim is that the most one ever gets from liberalism's invisible hand is an aggregate of private goods, not genuinely common good. The second condition makes clear the all-important connection between economic liberalism and the celebration of private individual judgment. So this is something that initially stems from theological liberalism. John Henry Newman, of course, defined liberalism as false liberty of thought, so defined liberalism as this liberation of private judgment. Hayek later will expand this claim about the superiority of widely distributed private information and judgment into an archetypically liberal account of markets, and Carl Schmitt into a liberal account of parliamentary debate, one that, needless to say, Schmitt did not share. I'll get to that later. Okay, and finally, we have the final piece of the structure is that these goods are produced through self-interested competition in a decentralized structure of interactions. It might be a commercial marketplace, it might be a marketplace of ideas, a constitutional system of checks and balances, and so forth. The point is that these systems they're not just one tool in the toolkit, like a policy instrument, like a minimum wage or something. This shift to an indirect emergent structure is a critical trick, because it allows liberal actors to square provision of human goods with the horror of authoritative direction. To put it another way, the target or antonym exists on two levels. On one level, the target is human positive law understood as rational authoritative ordinances directed towards the common good. On a higher level, the target is the very providence of God itself, which in the classical conception is inherently directive, purposive, and authoritative. As St. Thomas put it, providence is the very type of things ordered towards an end. Okay, a little bit of background so I don't embarrass myself in front of the intellectual historians. The invisible hand as a phrase is, of course, associated with Adam Smith. He first uses it in a treatise on astronomy in an explicitly theistic way, referring to the invisible hand of Jupiter. Then he uses it in the theory of moral sentiments, and finally, most famously, in the Wealth of Nations. There's a huge background to this, which doesn't include the phrase, but which includes the idea. It's an enormously rich tradition of providentialist theorizing about politics that anticipates many of the problematics of liberal theory. So it's hard to know where to begin. I'm only just going to mention one example. Theodoret of Cyrus, maybe not a household name, Theodoret argued in the mid-5th century AD that all are better off with a society featuring a division of labor, differences of wealth, and a division into rulers and ruled. Really some kind of Smithian flavor, right? Than they would be in an unspecialized and egalitarian society. But Theodoret justifies his conclusions on entirely different grounds than modern theorists of the invisible hand do. Here, the social benefit is a regulation instituted by divine providence for the benefit of mankind, rather than a solely mechanical system-level consequence of decentralized interaction. I'm now going to make a bold claim that I don't have time to substantiate. The claim is that the history of liberalism's adaptation of the invisible hand is a history of putative secularization, in which the superintending design of providence is replaced by putatively mechanical systems. Later, I'm going to question the extent to which this arc is best described as secularization at all. Smith is not an example. I think that he's a firm believer in the providentialist version of the invisible hand. But it's certainly true that when we come to contemporary theorists like Edna Ullmann-Margalit, the invisible hand is seen squarely as a rejection of providentialist thinking. So for Ullmann-Margalit, the invisible hand is what is the conclusion you come to when heroic minds like Hume and Kant have realized that the argument from design is a fallacy and that we can have goods arising through no one's intention. Okay, let me turn to some examples. I want to just show to you how pervasive, very pervasive, this trick is in the kind of recognizably liberal constitutional orders. Welfare or preference satisfaction, truth or information, political liberty, all these things have been claimed to arise from invisible hand processes. Before I get into the particular examples, though, I just want to say a word about the striking unity of this thought across its different branches. It's not as though the theorists of these different subsystems are unaware of the theorists of the other subsystems. That is, people are explicitly drawing inspiration for their arguments about markets from arguments about equilibrium of estates, king, lords, and commons, and so on. These ideas are cross-fertilizing, so much so that, again, Schmidt said that the dominant idea of European thought since the 16th century was the idea of a balance of opposing forces that yields beneficial system results. And that the characteristic reflex of liberalism is this parallelism between welfare production and economic liberalism, truth production in the marketplace of ideas, and the production of free government through the constitutional balance of powers. Free markets are the paradigm case. It's so familiar, I'm not going to spend much time on it. There are two variants, the neoclassical general equilibrium model, in which markets are taken to maximize aggregate preference satisfaction under constraints, and the Hayekian version in which markets are taken to produce coordinating information. In the neoclassical version, all available trades are consummated, and that ensures both allocative and productive efficiency. The economy reaches one or another Pareto optimal allocation, which one depends on the initial conditions, such that any reallocation would make at least one person worse off. Nothing in this account addresses the distributive effects of the market, and that's an entirely separate question that I'll return to later. But at least in this sense, perfectly competitive markets conduce to the maximization of welfare. In Hayek's variant, which is has this Austrian flavor, the main benefit of market competition is informational efficiency, which coordinates social plans. The price system impounds widely dispersed, tacitly held information about the real cost of resources, and thus the market coordinates individual expectations better than any centralized planner could achieve. Competition serves not only as a mechanism for preference satisfaction, but it serves an epistemological function as a discovery procedure that reveals objective information about the world, including, this is slightly tricky, the objective information about expectations of others. But that too counts. Okay, the marketplace of ideas. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. famously wrote that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Here the market's strictly metaphorical, but the idea is that just that truth will emerge from the decentralized interaction of individuals freely expressing competing ideas. The truth is acknowledged to be desirable, but it's not, again, pursued directly by authority concerned with the common good. Rather, it's taken to rise indirectly out of appropriately structured interactions. This can occur either throughout kind of ill-defined sphere of public discourse, or more specifically within a constitutional body like an assembly. So I mentioned Schmitt's remarkable parallel to Hayek's vision of widely distributed private information. Schmitt's parallel account is that the essence of liberal parliamentarism lies in the following idea, the idea that particles of reason that are strewn unequally among human beings gather themselves and bring public power under their control. So we have widely dispersed private information that through a balance of forces in a freely discussing parliament will bring public power under control. Well, whatever the precise features of the account, I think it's possible to separate these ideas into conceptual and empirical versions. In the conceptual versions, truth is simply defined as whatever emerges from an appropriately structured process of open discussion. In the empirical version, usually associated with John Stuart Mill, the claim is that truth tends to emerge on average and in the long run. Okay, checks and balances. Let me turn to the balance of constitutional powers. Thinkers as diverse as Montesquieu, de Maistre, and Schmitt thought that the crucial example of the balance of constitutional powers was the equilibrium of the English unwritten or uncodified constitutional order. Idea of a liberty-protecting equilibrium among the estates, kings, lords, and commons is adapted by early modern theorists to become somewhat differently a balance among institutions wielding distinct constitutional powers, legislative, executive, and judicial. This is a familiar story from people like M.J.C. Weil. In the United States, the framers of the federal constitution are then in general heavily influenced by Montesquieu and by the Scottish Enlightenment, very much including Adam Smith. One of the most striking, I think, findings of constitutional originalist theory in the past generation or so is the deep influence of and direct influence of Adam Smith on the American founders. So Madison's scheme has this invisible hand system of checks and balances in which competition among institutions as ambition counteracts ambition, prevents any one of them from attaining a monopoly of power and thereby protects liberty. This sits in some kind of uneasy relationship to the idea that the constitutional structure will filter and select elevated characters, and it sits in an uneasy relationship to the idea of virtue among the governors, and one of the great problematics of constitutional theory in this period has been to struggle with that question. Madison was here heavily influenced by Smith's invisible hand account of religious pluralism. So this is probably the immediate inspiration for the invisible hand structures of our constitutional order. So on Smith's account, the absence of any established church meant that a variety of sects would have to compete for adherence. On Smith's view, this competition would have the beneficial consequence that individual sects would have to moderate and soften their views, acceding to a regime of mutual toleration. Now, from the standpoint of the individual sects, each of which desires a privileged position, this isn't at all a benefit. Okay, there's nothing in an invisible hand structure that says that the agents acting out of self-interested motives actually attain the desires of their hearts. In fact, they often don't. So a seller in a competitive market who can't price above marginal cost is frustrated. It's not fun to be a seller in a competitive market. But the suggestion is that benefits accrue to consumers and to society at large. And exactly the same with Smith's picture of religious competition. There's a version of this for the extended republic and federalism. Madison says the extended republic built on a federal system will produce a beneficial mutual jarring of factions, would prevent any one of them from assembling a majority coalition. under communication conditions in which communication is checked by distrust. So just in our constitutional order, we have checks and balances among branches, we have religious competition, we have federalist competition, and so on. Now let me move to within the legal system somewhat. There are a number of invisible hand ideas that are absolutely central to our legal system. The most famous one is probably the adversary system. So the adversary system, as opposed to an inquisitorial system, is typically justified on invisible hand reasoning. J.F. Stephen, the barrister and judge, argued that in principle the inquisitorial system of criminal procedure is best. It's beyond all question the true one. However, if we distrust the authority to direct the inquisitorial system to the ends of the common good, this is the typical liberal fear, then what we should do is to consider the trial mainly as a litigation and to allow each party to say all that can be said in support of their own view, just as the best means of arriving at the truth in respect of any controverted matter of opinion might be to allow those who maintained opposite views to discuss the matter freely and in public. So this is a claim that whereas an inquisitorial system posits a magistrate who aims directly and intentionally at collecting all relevant information, the adversary system produces an indirect competitive structure of adversary production that will yield more information overall, even though neither party is intending to benefit the tribunal. They're just intending to benefit themselves, their clients. The whole common law has been justified on invisible hand grounds. There are many different versions of this. I find them all extremely puzzling and implausible, so I'm only going to mention one, which is the so-called Cardozo Theorem. This is a famous apothegm from Justice Benjamin Cardozo in a book on common law reasoning. And I'm only going to mention this because it sets up some wonderful stuff by John Henry Newman shortly. But here's what Justice Cardozo said. The eccentricities of judges balance one another. One judge looks at problems from the point of view of history, another from the point of view of philosophy, one from social utility, one's a formalist, one is afraid of change, another is dissatisfied with the present. Out of the attrition of diverse minds, there is beaten something which has a constancy and uniformity and average value greater than its component elements. So we have this picture in which the interaction among judges with individual eccentricities, deciding cases over time, leads without any individual judge necessarily intending it to a body of law with socially beneficial properties. Okay. I've thrown a lot of examples at you, again, just to underscore my message that this kind of move from direct authoritative pursuit of the common good to indirect creation of structures that conduce to the common good is so pervasive in the liberal constitutional order. I want to be clear about what the examples do and don't show. An invisible hand account is not by itself necessarily a liberal account. There's a crucial ambiguity in Ferguson's formulation, a result of human action but not of human design. So we have to think about this carefully. That last clause, not of human design, is consistent with either of two entirely distinct possibilities. One possibility is that the emergent system-level good arises as a result of no one's design, through some non-intentional mechanism that causes it to arise. Now, the system that produces that mechanism may itself have been intentionally set up by human beings, but that's not inconsistent with Ferguson's point. The other possibility, that reading not of human design, is to say that the emergent system-level goods arises as a result of non-human design. Not through human intentions, but still through intentions. Well, whose intentions? The intentions of God, through the divine design for which providence is a shorthand. Okay? So this distinction means there are two entirely different versions of invisible hand accounts and principled providential accounts and mechanistic accounts. Just as in many other areas, there can be liberal and non-liberal justifications for important concepts in legal and constitutional theory or political theory. I think civility is a terrific example that has both non-liberal and liberal justifications. We can have very similar structures resting on either a living providentialist foundation or a mechanistic one. Just to illustrate my context more concretely, recall the Cardozo Theorem I just mentioned, in which different judges with eccentric views produce over time a body of common law that's superior to any of the decisions taken individually. For that account to succeed, there has to be some mechanism by which these biases in some way offset one another. That's not obvious. It's not obvious at all. The alternative, of course, is just that decision-making according to the biases of successive judges might just yield an increasingly incoherent, disjointed, politicized body of law over time. There are plenty of areas of law like that in which we have a kind of series of decisions from different political and legal standpoints that don't yield some higher coherence. They just yield a total mess. So Cardozo was filled with faith that his higher coherence would come to pass, yet he offered no real mechanism to explain his faith. If anybody's really interested in this, two Harvard economists, Andre Schleifer, my colleague, and his student Nicola Genioli, have offered models that try to cash out the Cardozo theorem. I don't think those models are generally successful, but if you're interested, you can pursue that. Let me compare, however, the Cardozo theorem with two accounts that Cardinal Newman offered of invisible hand processes in the life of the church, in the life of Catholicism. These are structurally similar to Cardozo's, but justified in an entirely different way. So one of Newman's account is an account of the moderation and balance produced by the biases of successive ecumenical councils in the history of the church. So Newman wrote in correspondence, "It would seem as if the church moved on to the perfect truth by various successive declarations, alternately in contrary directions, perfecting, completing, supplying each other. Let us have a little faith in her, I say. Pius IX is not the last of the popes. The Fourth Council modified the third, the fifth, the fourth." So this was Newman in private correspondence expressing some faint-heartedness, let's say, about the First Vatican Council, but suggesting that future councils would bring a kind of moderation and balance. In a second account, Newman explicitly compared the theory of checks and balances in this liberal invisible hand setup to the endless contest between authority and private judgment in the life of the church. So here's Newman. He says, "As in a civil polity, the state exists and endures by means of the rivalry and collision, the encroachments and defeats of its constituent parts." So that's king, lords, and commons and their eternal self-mutually checking struggle. So in like manner, Catholic Christendom is no simple exhibition of religious absolutism, but presents a continuous picture of authority and private judgment alternately advancing and retreating as the ebb and flow of the tide. So the suggestion there seems to be that, as in a civil polity, the rivalry and collision in a checks and balances system produces some higher good like constitutional liberty, so too the eternal struggle of authority and private judgment in ecclesiology and theology will produce some higher good of the true balance. I just am making a simple methodological point that there's a crucial difference between the Cardozo theorem on the one hand and the two Newman theorems on the other, and that the difference is not that the former arises as a result of human action but not of human design. So it's true of both. Adam Ferguson's statement is equally true of both. Neither rests on human design, and any suggestion that Ferguson's formulation uniquely describes the liberal invisible hand account is a confusion. Rather, the difference is that the Newman theorems implicitly posit the superintending infallible hand of providence, whereas the Cardozo theorem rests on a hypothetical unspecified mechanism that causes the desirable system-level result to emerge. The open question is always whether and to what extent such a mechanism can be supplied and whether it is in fact supported by evidence. Now, of course, I don't at all mean to imply that there are no open questions for the providentialist view. That's the whole domain of theodicy, and I'll come back to that at the very end. But all I mean to say is that the secularized version of the invisible hand needs both a conceptually adequate mechanism, and it needs evidence to show that that mechanism actually holds. Okay, I'm now in position to complete my thesis. Liberalism attempts to replace providence with non-intentional mechanistic accounts of the production of goods. But this secularization systematically promises more than it can deliver. So it's true for systematic and not just happenstance reasons that these mechanisms are far too fragile to support the claims made for them. The consequence then becomes a marked tendency to liberal fideism, to ever more fervent insistence on the scope and power of the liberal invisible hand, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. I'm just going to do this for free markets and for checks and balances. In the underlying paper, I do it for the other accounts I've mentioned as well. For free markets, so there's a popular lecture series on economics. This is the basic introduction to economics for, I believe it's Yale undergraduates. And there's a session devoted to the invisible hand. And it lists a series of 8 overlapping conditions that have to obtain for Smith's invisible hand to hold, as interpreted by the results of neoclassical general equilibrium theory. These include an open market, that is, no barriers to entry, absence of monopoly power, absence of monopsony power, fine-grained division of production and consumption, no producers with pivotal private technology. And this one, you're not going to believe I'm quoting it, but I really am, I assure you. It says perfect information, more or less truthful information across the whole market. And finally, government to enforce property and contract rights. I mean, needless to say, this bears, the same relationship to actually existing economies that Star Trek bears to kind of our Navy or something. It's not even conceptually clear what perfect information means in a world of limited attention and computational capacity. Now, of course, it's a main research program of neoclassical economics to relax these conditions as far as possible, but it just seems indisputable, and I refer you to a book called The Invisible Hand by a Georgetown economist who goes through all these conditions one by one, that the conditions for productive and allocative efficiency in competitive markets are just highly fragile. What about Hayek's version? Hayek's version was an attempt to improve on the neoclassical model by making more plausible informational assumptions, but it counters other difficulties in its turn. I'm going to confine myself to just one critical issue. So the Hayekian argument for the informational efficiency of markets notoriously suffers from self-undermining incentives. So here's how it goes. Market actors have incentives to acquire costly information only if they can profit from it. But if they can profit from it, then precisely on Hayekian grounds, their information will be transmitted via the price system to competitors who may profit as well, even though they haven't made costly investments. So anticipating the free rider problem, no one may invest in information, but if that occurs, then everyone has incentives to do so, and so forth. This is a famous proof by Stiglitz and Grossman that there's no general equilibrium solution across the market for the cost of information. the more efficient the price system becomes at conveying information, the worse the free rider problem becomes. So in this sense, no market can be fully informationally efficient even in principle, and Hayek's appeal to the price system to give an informational rationale for free markets is in this sense self-defeating. Well, what about checks and balances? This is a powerful liberal faith. It's even passionate. But three very serious problems have been identified. I'm being very sketchy and broad here, but I'm just going to class the problems into three different buckets. First is the gap between individual incentives and interests on the one hand and institutional incentives and interests on the other. That is, what is good for Congress need not be good for individual legislators. What is good for the judiciary need not be good for individual judges. And the consequence of this gap is that there's no particular reason to think that it's generally true that actors within institutions have incentives to support the interests of their institutions in a Madisonian struggle. There's a version of this, an argument that the presidency is far less afflicted by this problem than are the other branches, and this is what explains the long-run growth of presidential power in our system over time. Whatever the case, the point is just that the claimed equilibrium benefits of the Madisonian invisible hand need not materialize. A second very serious issue is that there's no external enforcer standing above the constitutional systems of checks and balances to force institutions to compete. What if institutions decide instead to engage in various forms of collusion, power sharing, or delegation in ways that may make them better off while undermining the system of ambition counteracting ambition? So in an idealized ordinary market, what prevents price fixing by competitors is antitrust law. So firms want to collude to set prices above marginal cost. One hopes the antitrust enforcer will catch them. But this presupposes an enforcing sovereign external to the market mechanism. There's no such enforcer external to the constitutional order, however, and so there's no analog to antitrust enforcement. One has to rely on the hope that checks and balances is a fully self-enforcing equilibrium. My major point of agreement with Professor Philip Hamburger is that that's spectacularly been falsified by history, and that the idea that our system of checks and balances has maintained this equilibrium over time is blatantly false. Okay, the final issue is that the analogy to market competition assumes away a critical issue. The critical issue is there's no price system in the constitutional order. So bracketing my critiques of Hayek, the whole idea, both in the neoclassical version and in the Hayekian version, that made explicit markets produce anything good, whether welfare or information, is the price system. But what corresponds to that in the market, if you like, for constitutional checks and balances? There's no systematic reason to think that the equilibrium level of competition or the balance of power resulting from that competition will correspond to any socially desirable state of affairs. In explicit markets, what the price system does is it tells you the real cost of resources. There's no analog in constitutional competition. There's no way of making the equilibrium outcome match up to anything socially desirable. If it does, it's just a happy accident. Okay, what's going on in all these examples? I think there are two major ways of understanding the structurally imperfect secularization of the liberal invisible hand. And the first way I'm going to call the dilemma of verification. The dilemma of verification. This is that the systematic inability to tell whether and to what extent invisible hand systems actually work is not itself an accident. It's built into the nature and justification of such systems. If individual goods could be directly identified, generated, and allocated, there wouldn't be a need for the indirection of liberalism's invisible hand in the first place. So Hayek made a famous observation about competition as a discovery procedure, I think not realizing, and this is a brilliant observation, and not realizing that it's a problem for his own theory. Here's what Hayek said about the idea of competition as a discovery procedure. It would be patently absurd to sponsor a contest if we knew in advance who the winner would be. The only reason we use competition at all has as its necessary consequence the fact that the validity of the theory of competition can never be empirically verified for those cases in which it is of interest. So how do we know that Wimbledon identified the best tennis player? The reason we're having the tournament is we don't have agreed upon extrinsic criteria for identifying who the best tennis player is anyway. The problem bedevils any number of invisible hand systems. As to the adversary system, putting aside unusual cases where we get like DNA evidence or something after the fact, as a law professor observed, we can't learn directly whether the facts are really as the trier determined them because we don't ever find out the facts. We don't usually get an announcement from God that the defendant really was guilty or not. As to explicit markets, to appoint a centralized bureau to collect all the information needed to determine whether the price system in fact processes information effectively would be a kind of conceptual blunder, right? It would rest on a misunderstanding of the informational rationale for decentralized prices. What about free speech and constitutional checks and balances? Well, I want to consider a claim. I'm going to say something mean. I think this claim is absurd. It's a claim advanced in a very interesting book by a guy named Luther Gulick, who was an American official in World War II in the Office of Price Administration. And he wrote a book arguing that the Allied liberal democracies had defeated the Axis powers because of free speech. And his claim was that free speech had allowed the Allies to learn from their mistakes more quickly than their adversaries. What's wrong with this claim? Well, when total warfare puts whole societies into existential competition, all that you get from the experiment is that victory went to one whole integrated entity over the other whole integrated entity. Whether victory was owed to the First Amendment or as opposed to America's favorable geographic and material circumstances or opposed to mistaken strategic decisions by the German High Command or whatever, it's impossible to say in an N=1 experiment. We never have the kind of fine-grained information we need to determine which component of a whole society has caused it to prevail, or indeed whether all components were necessary or some subset were jointly necessary and sufficient, who knows? So the problem is in this and other cases, the same indirect structure that allows liberalism to reconcile its commitment to autonomy with its horror of obedience also makes it structurally difficult to discern whether the invisible hand works as promised. So much for the dilemma of verification. Let me turn to the second large problem, which I called the self-undermining propensities of the liberal invisible hand. There are here two subcases, the depletion of pre-liberal social capital and public choice problems. The first, I think, is pretty familiar. So the idea is that liberalism's invisible hand stories malfunction when their own individualistic and mechanistic premises undermine the very preconditions that are necessary for the mechanism to work. Preconditions that it's argued pre-exist liberalism and can't be replaced by it. So there are a variety of hypotheses have been suggested here involving the undermining of trust, the undermining of unwritten norms and conventions, or other forms of pre-liberal solidaristic social capital necessary for the operation of invisible hand systems. The economist Ken Arrow who you may know from his impossibility theorem, wrote extensively on this theme, and his view was, he put it this way: the costs of contracting and enforcing contracts make it impossible to exclude all forms of literalism, circumvention of promises, and chicanery. Norms of good faith are thus necessary to facilitate exchange. So the legal system can never fully replace good faith, trust, solidaristic norms, and Arrow thought that these were frequently undermined by the operation of, or I don't want to overclaim, that could be undermined by the operation of market mechanisms. Whatever the details, that sort of point has been made as to every invisible hand system. Free markets, the checks and balances, the adversary system, all of these presuppose, even if only implicitly, background conditions that allow competition to occur within stable boundaries under regulated conditions. And the claim is typically that, that these competitive systems resemble regulated warfare, which in some times and places occurs within a stable framework that it's claimed makes everyone better off. And typically the suggestion is that the individualistic and competitive ethos or mindset needed to succeed within these systems actually undermines the norms, conventions, solidaristic emotions that are necessary for this regulated competition. Now, I said this was pretty familiar stuff because there are a bewildering variety of contrary hypotheses, and Albert Hirschman spent a lot of his career showing that there was nothing general you could say about this, that in some contexts some of these are plausible, in other contexts maybe markets actually conduce to generating norms of trust, or there's a view that critiques liberalism from the opposite direction, the feudal shackles thesis that says that the persistence of pre-liberal norms or attitudes actually hamper the free operation of liberalism's invisible hand systems. The complexities are infinite. I don't need to know the answer to that to make my point. Indeed, my whole point is that we don't know the answer to that, and that there's no reason to think there's a general answer, and that if our conclusion is only that there's a kind of debilitating uncertainty about this, then it contributes to the argument that liberalism's invisible hand accounts outrun any possible evidence or kind of theory that we have to defend them. The public choice problem, I think, is maybe less familiar, at least in some audiences. Earlier, I assumed temporarily that in idealized markets, antitrust rules and other institutions prevent competitive agents from subverting the process of competition itself. The public choice theorists have argued that the same premises that make the liberal invisible hand story go also suggest that the self-interested agents within the frameworks of these stories will have every incentive to undermine or subvert the frameworks themselves. So it's a funny but interesting insight in which the agents within these parables of the invisible hand kind of escape the storyteller's control and start to undermine the stories themselves. So imagine a self-interested actor, like a corporate actor, who just prices in as an expected cost any legal risk, including the legal risk from attempting to subvert the framework itself through political donations, through lobbying, through strategic litigation, in the limit even outright criminal bribery. Okay, all these things would just become calculable tools for shaping the very rules of the game for enduring advantage. You could corrupt the antitrust enforcer. You could procure regulation that insulates you against innovation by new challengers. You could, in exactly the same way you could pursue profits through innovation, you could try to pursue deterring innovation by others. The point is that the very motivations attributed to the agents within these competitive frameworks make the frameworks themselves potentially unstable. Okay, all these arguments I've been giving have been trying to show something. And let me put it this way. There's a structurally uncertain gap between promise and performance with respect to liberalism's invisible hand systems. Having denied the superintending role of providence, liberalism commits itself to trust in these seemingly magical or even miraculous processes for transmuting self-interested human motivations into the gold of system-level goods. But those motivations aren't so easily left behind. Agents who possess them may either work to undo the framework or lose the traits that were necessary for those systems to work in the first place. If this is right, then I think the result is a kind of uneasy halfway posture in which the invisible hand has to succeed so that this indirect approach to the good may prevail, but the providentialist underpinnings of the invisible hand that would ensure its success have been abandoned. And it's unclear what, if anything, has taken providence's place. The way out of this bind, I believe, is a kind of liberal fideism. It has to be believed, despite or indeed because of the radical contingency and uncertainty of liberalism's invisible hand, that the invisible hand will produce its beneficial results sooner or later in some eschatological future. Liberalism becomes increasingly strident, and in liberal societies, one literally encounters lay faith movements and quasi-religious orders centered, of course, they don't understand themselves as such, but I understand them as such. And I hope that by sufficient therapy, they can be brought to understand themselves as such. One encounters lay faith movements and quasi-religious orders centered on evangelizing and catechizing the benefits of free markets, free speech, constitutional liberties, the checks and balances. You could imagine, well, I won't make jokes about people going around with pocket constitutions, but you see where I'm going. So this gap between promise and performance is filled by a kind of radiant faith, but that faith has already disavowed the premises that would support it. And we get a kind of fanaticism. The answer to the problem of free markets is ever more free markets. If there's any economic problem, well, what it really shows is we need to liberalize the market further. The answer to the problems generated by the separation of power system is a renewal and reinforcement of the separation of powers. This is my argument with a bunch of constitutional originalists who say we need to renew our original separation of power system, and my response is, well, but whatever problems you now observe were generated by the operation of that system, and it's a kind of self-defeating commitment to say, let us renew the conditions that produced our current predicament. The cure for the ills generated by free speech is even more free speech, and so on. By supposing that the remedy is always to add fuel to the fire, we exacerbate the failures of the liberal invisible hand, intensifying its problems, and we end up, this is a kind of very large-scale unprovable claim, but I think it's true. It's that liberalism's accounts generate ever less allegiance from the populace, while the kind of elite theorists insist upon their truth all the more fervently. And this, to me, is something like the condition which Pat Deneen is so acutely documented and diagnosed around us today. Okay. Jacob Viner said something that I want to underscore in conclusion. Weiner wrote, there's no logical conflict between a socially oriented teleology and individualism if the individual either has conscious social ends or by providential design serves such ends without having adopted them as his own ultimate objective. That's absolutely true, and that's why Richard Whately could write in the 1830s that agents within free markets producing social level goods were themselves carrying out the superintending design of providence without knowing they were doing so. So it's my critique here is not about the first order structures. It is logically possible, for example, and Whately shows, to have a providentialist free market view. It's not one I share, but it's logically possible. My point is different. Having made both obedience to the divine and devotion to social ends into matters of private choice, liberalism can't adopt a Weiner solution. It has to find arrangements for pursuing social aims that do not constrain the beliefs or motivations of autonomous individuals in those ways. Arrangements that are robust to self-interested individual behavior and by a kind of substitute miracle emergently transform those selfish motivations into social goods. I don't at all want to be understood as saying that the invisible hand is the only strategy liberal theory uses to effect this reconciliation. There are a number of other strategies. I just think this is a central strategy for liberalism because it promises to reconcile this core tension. Well, my absolutely final word is, let me underscore what I have not claimed. I have not claimed that the providentialist version of the invisible hand is unproblematic or that it does not face analogous difficulties. The whole elaborate body of theodicy that struggles with providence and history testifies to the promises and problems. The very fact that the same sorts of arguments I deploy against liberalism's invisible hand accounts may also be deployed against the providentialist invisible hand is precisely the point. That's my point. Liberalism's characteristic obscurantism is to conceal its own character as political theology, as one of the great world religions. The triumphalist version of the liberal faith, and we see this very clearly in Oldman Margolet's famous papers, is that having finally transcended the great fallacy that ordered liberty requires a designing hand, we can now see how ordered liberty and its resulting goods arise indirectly, not by anyone's design. My suggestion is that this replaces one faith and with one political theology with another. Which faith is the true one is a separate question. But liberalism's invisible hand accounts, maybe it might be better to call them parables and to speak of liberalism as a parable-based vision of the world. They're no less complex and challenging than the providentialist parables they would replace. And I think the necessary miracles are no less astonishing. Thank you. Oh.
Sorry, well, thank you very much for an excellent lecture. We have about 10 minutes for questions and observations. While people are thinking, maybe I could just get that on the way by asking a question.
Please, sorry, yeah.
So the structure of this is we've got Ferguson's suggestion that order emerges out of human action, but not by human design. And then the question is, what might be the factor that leads to it? And one, according to one account, is mechanism, and according to another, it was a mechanism yet to be explained. According to another account, it's providence. There is a third possibility which you, I think, didn't consider. And this is actually connected.
Oh, I'm sorry, John.
Yeah, sorry. I was just, sorry, I was getting the discussion going by just asking a question. I was saying the framing structure of this is the observation of the Scottish thinker Adam Ferguson of the phenomenon of order emerging out of human activity but not by human design. And so the challenge that's been posed, the way in which this was framed, is that we need to say what the factor is that explains order in the absence of human design. And one suggestion is that it's some sort of mechanism operating at the human level, and the other one might be that it's providential. But I was just about observing that there is a third possibility that I don't think has yet been discussed, and a connection here, interestingly, that would take us in this direction possibly is that one great admirer of Ferguson was Hegel. And Hegel drew very much on Ferguson's theory of civil society. And so one possibility one might look for is something that's intermediary, as it were. And that might be something like, to adapt it to modern ways of thinking, a kind of partly evolutionary account of this. I don't mean in terms of biological evolution.
Yeah.
I just mean that something like immanent human reason, which is not designing certain outcomes, but will tend to converge upon certain outcomes. And the mechanism, or part of the mechanism that would explain that, would be the selectional advantage and the adaptive utility of certain kinds of solutions. So I don't know whether you want to say something briefly about that.
Yes, I would. I think it's great to point that out. I class those under my mechanistic accounts. So let me illustrate the liberal hand accounts of the common law exactly have this structure. So the typical claim is that the common law evolves over time to become more efficient through the selection of cases for litigation. The claim is that people tend to bring cases to overturn inefficient rules at a higher rate than to overturn efficient rules, and that over time, inefficient rules are weeded out. So it exactly has this, this mechanistic structure, if you want to call it that, in which individuals have no intention to produce a system-level benefit. They're acting for their own individual benefit, but over time the stock of rules becomes more efficient. That theory, which was advanced in law and economics in the 1970s, is either totally exploded or collapsed into contingency. That is, there are too many special cases in which it doesn't hold, and what are the conditions, and we have a whole degenerate research program of 9 million papers, and you just don't know when it's true and when it's not true. So it's actually an example of the sort of thing I mean. Yeah. Please.
Yes, Patrick Deneen, University of Notre Dame.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Patrick Deneen, University of Notre Dame.
I've met you.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know. I've heard of you.
Yeah.
Vermeulemine. So what's interesting in thinking about your presentation is that there's a tradition that explains the rise of liberalism in providential terms.
Yeah.
Right, so that, I mean, you see this, for example, a version of this in the beginning of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he suggests that the advent of Christianity ushers in the age of liberal democracy.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious is, since you seem to be a partisan of Providence, is there a way to explain the rise of liberalism as a providential fact in the context of Providence's design? And if that's the case, how would one explain, or I'm curious how you would respond, how one would explain the reason and purpose of this interlude in the wisdom of Providence?
That's a wonderful question, Patrick. It's one I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I think it's a...
Me too.
What?
Me too.
Yeah. You know, it's a major question for anyone. I mean, it's not as though Providence is some dispensable doctrine for Catholicism, right? So we need some kind of... If we are otherwise committed to the view that I hold, that there is a deep structural, at least, tension between Catholicism and liberalism, then we definitely need an account of this. And I can't claim to have one. That would be like a giant, life enterprise. But I would say a couple things. Could we imagine a future in which we looked back and said, God is very great because the growth of liberalism has spread the Catholic faith around the globe in ways that might not have been otherwise imaginable. And I think that is a non-crazy beginning to an answer, at least. So that's where I would go. Yeah.
Hi, Mark Ryland from Great Falls, Virginia. It's a great paper. I'm wondering if there's a bit of a shortcut in your argument. You talked about Cardozo's invisible hand.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I thought maybe there was a little bit of a shortcut I might suggest in your argument. You talk about Cardozo's invisible hand and
Yeah.
the two criteria. You have to have a plausible mechanism. You have to have it in place. But don't you also have to have a criterion of judgment by which you can detect whether it's actually making something better or not? There's this fundamental normativity that every one of these methods requires, and that seems to me is kind of smuggled in, and now we're back to something that the invisible hand can't explain.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. So two things. One is this is based on a long underlying paper that's coming out in American Affairs, and to make the presentation version, I did what the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist used to do, which is take out all the reasoning. So it's full of lacunae like that. A component of any invisible hand claim is that what emerges, we have some value theory that identifies what emerges as either goods or bad. I tried to say, maybe I was too brisk about it, I was trying to bracket that for purposes of this presentation. The thing, when you talk about that, you'd have to talk about whether the goods that liberalism identifies are actually common goods or strictly private aggregated goods. So I try to say that's a whole class of problems I'm just not getting into. So I'm assuming for purposes of this presentation that welfare is good, that truth is good, that liberty is good, and so on. Yeah.
Ricardo Calleja from the University of Navarra, Spain.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It reminded me to this dialogue brought by Hobbes between the student of the common law and a philosopher, in which Hobbes, who is the liberal, seems to be endorsing the opposite, your position. So the critique to the common law as an evolving thing, which is on reasoning within itself, that you say is the liberal thing. But apparently at that moment in time, at least, there was a system of common law that wasn't liberal, at least philosophically, and Hobbes was the liberal. So my question is, what is the role of, within a non-liberal political philosophy, what is the role of adversarial, non-explicit coordination of human actions, such as private property?
Well, okay, there are a couple of things to untangle here. One is I am probably the most ignorant in this room about Hobbes, or at least there are many people in here who understand Hobbes much better than I do. It seems to me always treacherous to talk about Hobbes being or not being liberal, that his relationship to liberalism is that of a kind of ambiguous precursor or something like that, so it's complicated. Another thing I would say is that it is not like a fortuitous claim or an accidental claim or an ungrounded claim that the common law is bound up with liberalism. That is, British liberalism takes the common law to be its benchmark for law. Why does it do that? Because it sees the common law, precisely as John said, as evolved not through human design in a way that it takes to be superior to, or potentially superior to, the direct authoritative purposive action of legislation or other. Okay. So that's the sense in which I class the common law with the other liberal systems. Now, whether there are non-liberal justifications for private property, of course there are. And they're on display in all the 19th century Catholic social thought. So again, the fact that we remove a liberal justification just opens a further question whether we have a different type of justification.
Thank you.
Tamlin Shang from Christendom College. Thank you for your presentation. My question for you is, what does the pursuit of greatness look like within the context of liberalism, or does it even exist?
The pursuit of what?
Greatness, I'm sorry.
Greatness, the pursuit of greatness. There is I talked about this a bit at the Thomistic Institute conference a couple weeks ago, there's a strand of liberal theory that is deeply worried about the pursuit of greatness. I mean, certainly this is like, you know, the do commerce thesis has this horror of glory-seeking agents who want to become great. That's pretty familiar. But there's also just the more mundane thought in kind of negative strands of liberalism, like Poppers and Schlars, that try to rule out, above all, tyranny, that the people who want to be great are more prone to become tyrants. And that's the main target for constitutional design. So I think there's a kind of horror of greatness that stems from the horror of authority in some way. I think that's the main strand, but like everything else, it's complicated. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Robert Burton. I'm a PhD student in political science here at Notre Dame, and thank you for your presentation. One of the themes that seemed to arise through your various examples was the need for a higher enforcer. So for example, in the constitutional order—
Need for what?
A higher enforcer, right? So in your example of you know, a Madisonian checks and balance system, the problem is there's no higher enforcer. In terms of a free market, there's the problem of needing, you know, some sort of antitrust legislation, a higher enforcer to meet certain problems that arise from just the spontaneous action of the individuals within whatever sphere is at play. The question that it raised for me, and
This is an attempt to fit the conference theme, of course.
well, right.
Yeah, right.
My question is this need for higher enforcement seems to presuppose that there is a place, or that the enforcer is necessarily any better than the actors acting individually, in some sense.
No, I'm sorry, the opposite. I don't mean to interrupt your question, but
Go
I
ahead,
didn't
yeah.
at all mean to say that. I mean, the hope, the idealized picture is that the enforcer is in some way better, either motivationally or informationally, than the actors within the system.
Right.
But my point precisely was that a lot of invisible hand stories may fail when and because that's not true. That is, for example, when agents within the system corrupt the enforcer, or, okay, so
Right.
I didn't want to be understood as committed to saying
maybe
that. Yeah.
I'll ask the question, and then if it...
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you just finish this question, just John? Because I feel I interrupted it. Yeah.
You're fine. My question was, if we assume or believe in the corrupted nature of human beings,
Yeah.
isn't that then essentially a political problem, not necessarily a liberal or other problem, that the enforcer could be just as corrupt as the free actors in the system itself? In which case, it's really a political problem, not a problem particular to liberalism or something
Well,
else.
that is a problem. It's just not my problem. Like, that's a separate problem. So my problem was that the motivations that the liberal invisible hand theory attributes to its agents aren't sustainable in equilibrium, because those motivations will spill over, as it were, through the agents taking action to constrain or corrupt the enforcer. Now, it's a separate point if you want to say, well, the enforcer is independently already corrupt because human nature has fallen. I mean, that I emphatically agree with, but it wasn't the argument I was making then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I am Ben Story from Furman University. Thank you for the talk. You gave us a nicely delimited argument, I think intended to show that liberalism, which presents itself as something sort of scientific, not a faith, is in fact a faith, and oftentimes a very fideistic faith, which rests on relatively shaky grounds, if I understand the sort of
Right.
critical thrust of your paper.
Right.
Again, the case was nicely delimited, and I'd like you now, if you'd be willing, to step back and tell us why you want us to understand that. Where are you hoping we'll go?
Well, I think it's true. That's one thing. So it seems like a good necessary, if not sufficient, condition for a paper. The second thing is that the single most striking sociological fact about liberalism, in my view, is the lack of self-awareness of its agents. And it's a very critical conversation about why that's true. But to the extent that we can, through reasoned argument, produce a kind of therapy for that, then we ought to do so. And I think bringing liberalism to awareness of its own faith commitments is a worthwhile project.
Hello, my name is Teresa, and I'm a postdoc at Princeton. And as you were talking about the contemporary institutional balance of powers, this idea that it kind of produces liberty via fruitful tension and some kind of mechanistic invisible hand, it made me think of the much older tradition of the mixed regime, and in particular, the Aristotelian polity,
right,
what he calls the best practical regime, involving a mixture of elements of democracy and oligarchy. And this is, like, in his account, the best approximation of justice and the best way to achieve a kind of political moderation.
Thank you for bringing this out. This is an important point.
Yeah. Just with a view to trying to pinpoint what's distinctive and distinctively problematic about the contemporary institutional balance of powers, could you identify what are the most salient differences between Aristotle's account and the modern one?
Well, I mean, look, this goes back to my point that we can have very different types of justifications for similar institutional structures. So when you sometimes hear theorists of the kind of early modern and subsequent liberal arguments for checks and balances appealing to Polybius as an ancestor, one's inclined to say, no, that's not correct, because the Polybian justification for this is one that does not at all sound in liberal theory. And I'm not an Aristotle expert either, but I think that's true there as well. So that I certainly not only imagine, but know, a tradition of the mixed regime running from Aristotle through Aquinas to modern theorists like Legutko, who argue that the mixed regime is best because it conduces to substantive, genuinely common good. But that's not the liberal argument. Yeah.
Seamus Wick from Christendom College. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, it seems like the political left has kind of they've chosen like one version of the liberal invisible hand theory for like social application, but then they kind of reject the economic side of the coin. And I was wondering if you think that's justified. If it can
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it.
So they seem to have they've like implemented the social idea of the liberal invisible hand, but not really the economic liberal invisible hand. And I was wondering if you think that can be justified.
So these are people who think that they're opposed to free markets, but
I guess,
I'm not getting
the political left in America. It seems like they accept the the liberal invisible hand for social applications, but not really like in terms of economics, they're more heavy-handed, I guess.
I mean, look, the world is full of people with kind of worldviews that are stapled together and don't have fully worked out consistent premises. And that's why people like Coase can write articles like the market for goods and the market for ideas. Why do you have such radically different views about the market for goods and the market for ideas? I don't know what to say other than that I agree with Schmidt that there's a kind of standing propensity. It's not a necessity, but there's a standing propensity within liberal constitutional orders to kind of have all these subsystems work together as a package, to have more or less free markets, more or less free, marketplaces of ideas, more or less checks and balances systems, and that's the kind of regime that we see in many places. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you again for an excellent lecture, which we will have the opportunity to read before too long, I hope. So thank you again.